Or perhaps a short while ago, images of people dancing in the streets in Harare, and they're celebrating the end of an era. 37 years ago, Robert Mugabe was jubilant. He won elections, I think, with nearly 70% of the vote back then, and a whole new era came into being. But over the years, he has squandered that faith, that love, that adoration. And this has culminated in his resignation today. He took on the army, he came short, and the people are celebrating on the streets today, saying goodbye, Mr. President. And so that's the end of Robert Mugabe, Tavile.
It's actually interesting, Peter, because I was saying to you that you've lived this whole thing out. I mean, you know the younger version of Robert Mugabe, one most of us have never seen.
He was, I can't put it any other way. When he came into Harare from Mozambique, and his first ever rally before the elections, I think almost 1 million people turned out for that one in Highfield. He was a hero of heroes, and I think his reputation endured for many, many years across the continent. Even when he came to South Africa, people would recognize him and see him as a continental hero. But I believe Criselda is in Harare right now, and throughout the course of this evening has been tracking the celebrations. Let's go to Harare now and see if we're still trying to track her down. So she's in the midst of it. To be honest with you, I wish I was there.
Do you wish you were there?
I wish I was there.
But it's actually looking at social media, because social media is a buzz, Peter. We've been looking at it and following it for a long time. Even Zimbabwean nationals in South Africa, in Hillbrow, parts of Johannesburg and across the country are celebrating, saying that they might be ready to go home.
No, it is historic. I mean, it's monumental. So there's a few other presidents on the continent who've been in power for a long time now. I'm thinking Paul Biya in Cameroon. We've got Obiang, Sassou Nguesso. So they must be looking at this. And what's his name? Uganda President Museveni. They must be looking at this and
thinking
wondering,
long and hard.
because this is part of the old guard now. And they're probably thinking, you know, has our time come and passed? Because Robert Mugabe, of all of the heads of state, perhaps was the most charismatic, the one who was famously able to stand at the United Nations and take on mighty Britain, take on the mighty US. And as the Africans would see him as the guy who put these Western powers in their place, he took on the UK. They had a love affair in the first few years, but that quickly soured and never really recovered. So for him, I think he would be sad today, because perhaps his ego, perhaps his pride got in the way, that he didn't see what was obvious. He didn't see.
Do you think he really didn't see it? And I want us to backtrack a little bit and look at what happened on Sunday, because the expectation was that he would resign and step down on Sunday, and that didn't happen, and everyone said Mugabe has won the day. And look at where we are now.
Well, let me take you back 2 weeks, 3 weeks. There were rallies right across the country full of Zanu-PF supporters endorsing Mrs. Mugabe as a potential vice president of the party. They voted her to become the Women's League president, and they were voting and endorsing Robert Mugabe to become president. So how could he not think, when he arrives at these rallies and sees these numbers, that they possibly couldn't love him? But clearly, all of those things were staged. People were forced to go. And if you didn't go, you put yourself on the wrong side of the authority of the day. But this outpouring on the streets there, I think, is volume. But let's go to Sophie Mkwena, who's been there since the weekend, to tell us a little bit more about what's happening on the ground. Sophie, the celebrations continue, and I suspect it will continue well into the night and to the early hours of the morning.
To celebrate what transpired today. As I indicated earlier on, indeed it is a new era, it's a new dawn, it's a new day for Zimbabweans, the country that had one president for quite a long time. You are aware that President Robert Mugabe, when he became a president after independence, There has never been any other president except President Robert Mugabe. His resignation today is very, very significant. But I want to continue with my colleague, Norma Bolane. We've been working, been out in the streets talking to the people, but also getting a sense in terms of what's likely to happen in this country after President Robert Mugabe. Norma, let's talk about the future. Emmerson Mnangagwa, where is Emmerson Mnangagwa now?
We understand that he's probably making his way back to Zimbabwe to take his position as the next leader and president of Zimbabwe. There have been some criticisms about him being party to some of the controversies that Mugabe has had over the years, but a lot of people here on the streets are very confident and excited that he's going to be the next in power.
President Robert Mugabe, during his address, he indicated that he is going to preside over Zanu-PF Congress. Do you think this will still happen?
I doubt that will happen because he was recalled on Sunday as the party president and today he resigned. I don't think he'll have any power to preside over the Congress next month.
One thing that I have observed is that much as Zimbabweans are angry, you know, they have serious issues with President Robert Mugabe. Some of them are saying they still respect President Mugabe, but they wanted him to go and rest.
Of course, many Zimbabweans still have respect for him. They see him as an elder. They wanted him to resign voluntarily because they didn't want to humiliate him by forcibly removing him from his office. They say they want his legacy to stand still as being a president who wasn't free.
When can we see the inauguration of a new president?
Thursday or Friday at the latest, but a new president chosen by the people should be within the next 90 days because the Constitution says that elections must be held.
Let's go back to Harare.
3 months.
Let's take two people just to get their views. Your views about President Robert Mugabe?
Mugabe is gone for good. And we are very happy that he's gone. We have suffered for a very long time, so he must go.
We can't have a 93-year-old president. No!
He should go.
No!
He should go for Zimbabwe.
Those are the views of ordinary people here in Zimbabwe. Over to you in Johannesburg.
Okay, so they're getting their 5 cents worth in there today. There's going to be no containing him. They're saying that we can't have a 95-year-old president. But as I said to you, Tabile, 3 weeks ago, there were rallies endorsing this 95-year-old president.
That's the thing.
And so, you know, one needs to put all of this into perspective, that there's a lot of people, perhaps genuinely, who still support the president, who would be sad this evening that he's gone. Perhaps these voices were not allowed to be heard before, and so today they're having their full expression. We had Patrick Joao, who is the nephew of Robert Mugabe. He was, you spoke to him at the weekend.
I did speak to him.
And he was in denial. I mean,
extremely in denial. I mean, the conversation was a very difficult one at that because he was very one-sided and he was saying, you know, first of all, you know, he was tired of everyone calling this a Zimbabwe crisis. It's a coup and we need to accept it. But people have also been duped, and he kept using that word a lot and saying that people have been duped by the army, saying that the army is duping the people of Zimbabwe and that the president is going to come out of this the winner and that he remains the president. But look at where we are today, and for me that's the most important thing. The transition that we've seen over the past year, those endorsements that you spoke of earlier, but also what we saw on Sunday and then today.
Yeah. And these would have been remarkable signs for a president who's intelligent, bright, and perhaps surrounded himself with people that were not always truthful to him and not always being honest. But let's go now to Pretoria, outside the Professor Keleboha Mapule, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. He's with UNISA, and we'd just like to ask you your thoughts on what we've seen this evening.
Yeah, good evening, Peter. This is quite an overwhelming historical moment, not only for Zimbabweans, but for people in the region as well as, the continent and globally. This is a historical moment because obviously we are seeing the end of an era. But in as much as we are also seeing the end of an era for Robert Mugabe, one wonders whether this is an end of an era also for the system, that has been keeping him in power for all these years. Because it's all very easy when we look at this historical moment of jubilation and euphoria, that we might lose sight of the fact that there are fundamental issues in terms of the Zimbabwean situation, the Zimbabwean question. So for me, basically, it's a question of what does this, forecast for Zimbabwe, for the region, as well as for the continent in general.
So activists inside Zimbabwe, and we were speaking to the opposition MDC right now, and there seems to be this quiet caution. So today they're popping their champagne, they're celebrating, but in reality nothing has really changed because Zanu-PF is still the party in power, and the characters that are leading the party have been there since 1980, many of them. So how, some people are wondering, can there honestly be a change? Has anything really happened other than the leadership has just changed chairs?
Absolutely. I think we need to wait for a couple of weeks, a couple of months, maybe even, for us to see as to how the situation is really unfolding. Because on the one hand, we thought we were looking at this coup, as some called it a soft coup. I called it a coup of another type, Zimbabwean style. Whereby, we think that the leader is in power, but at the same time he might be having guns, behind him, propping him one way or the other. So we can only wait for a bit more to see as to what the situation that is unfolding before us will, portend. On the one hand, we have to be optimistic that as we can see the scenes of jubilation in Zimbabwe, as well as probably globally among Zimbabweans, that perhaps this will be a lesson that the incumbent, the new incumbent, one is to say, in waiting, Emmerson Mnangagwa, that he will obviously be taking cue from the scenes of jubilation, as well as the comments, as well as the concerns of those people that were protesting, in the streets earlier, waiting for Mugabe to, mention that he's going to resign. So that's the optimism on the one hand. But there's also a sense of pessimism on the other hand, as you have rightly mentioned, because in my view, much of the machinery that propped Mugabe and kept him in power for 37 years still remains intact. For instance, as we look forward, we are quite aware that Zimbabwe will be going for elections, hopefully, very soon, in the next 6 to 9 months. But my question is, that machinery that used to terrorize Zimbabweans, forcing them to vote for Zanu-PF and threatening them, one way or the other, that if they don't vote for the party, then therefore they are going to be, harassed in one way or the other. Has that machinery disintegrated? And if it hasn't, one has to be cautiously optimistic about what is happening currently. The other issue is the role of the military. We have seen it in Lesotho that once the military tastes power, even just a little bit, it's like that lion or that beast which has tasted human blood that will continuously attack humans wherever it prowls. So my slight concern is also about the army. Will they go back to the barracks? Will they realize that, okay, now the civilians have to take over and we have to now take the back seat? Or now that they've tasted power, like that beast, the proverbial beast I was talking about, will they be on the sidelines, just like we have seen in the situation of Lesotho, and continue to be an element of instability, hovering in the background? So that is, for me, one of the biggest concerns.
But hasn't the army always been part of the political machinery, even though they perhaps were not visible? But it was always quite clear that the military had to be appeased. Whenever the country ran out of money, the army was always paid first. When we had the land grabs and the war veterans being paid their compensation, he was always careful to take care of the army over the years because he knew that his power, his base, was the support of the army.
Absolutely. We have had, one could say, a predominant role of the military, but I should say mostly in the background. Lurking behind, as it were. We all remember the situation when Tsvangirai was, won the elections a few years ago, where some elements in the military clearly stated that they would not salute, someone like Tsvangirai who does not have struggle credentials as they alleged. So to that extent, I agree with you. The military has always been lurking behind. But one got a sense over the past 3.5 decades or so that they were under the leash, as it were, of Mugabe, as their commander-in-chief. And it was more like a resource that could be used, one way or the other to terrorize the civilians, into voting for the party or at least supporting the party one way or the other. But now that he's gone, one wonders whether the one that is coming in, will he be able to keep that leash? Or will he be also using the very same, strategy in the military, more like a bargaining chip, with the civilian politicians that are coming in? Civilian, I would say, knowing that Mnangagwa also has a military background as a former guerrilla and somebody who has been in charge of the security apparatus.
Some might say that General Chiwenga has gained some political capital at this time. We've seen it with Lieutenant General Jerry Rawlings in Ghana, who then went on to become a politician and a civilian president. Do you think that we might see Chiwenga coming out of the army and following a political career?
Peter, that point that you were mentioning is very critical, because coming here, I was actually thinking as to what is, the military strategy so far, because I tend to think that the current situation that is unfolding before us somehow has been orchestrated with or without the military, acting an active or more behind the scenes role. So I would think that the military would like to make sure that they have their men, as it were, because normally it's predominantly men, coming in to guarantee their interests. Not that Mugabe didn't guarantee their interests. He did do that. He had some concessions, as you said. Also, we must add to the mix the war veterans who, up until recently, of course, made a U-turn and started supporting the popular revolt against Mugabe. But I agree that Chiwenga definitely is larger than life right now, and we could see him, playing some very, active role in Zimbabwe's, reconstitution, as it were. However, we mustn't forget that you have alluded to some of those, soldiers in the continent, Ghana, Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings. I could also refer to a recent case whereby this soldier was marched out of power in the Gambia, Yaya Jammeh, who reinvented himself from a military, coup leader to a civilian, quote-unquote, leader. But of course, that was voted out in 2016 by the Gambians. That we have got to be very careful about this prebendalism, this very advent of soldiers, somehow undergoing political metamorphosis, whereby they leave the barracks and then therefore they come in and become, quote-unquote, civilian politicians. Whereas, in fact, they are civilian politicians covered in wool, whereas they are actually supporting or safeguarding the interest of the military. So, yes, I am open to being persuaded that, Chiwenga, we could see him, not only him, maybe other elements within the military that are also eyeing this space as to flexing their muscles and, of course, bargaining with the politicians behind the scenes to guarantee their interests.
Now, the Zimbabwe that President Zuma woke up to this morning is completely different from the one that they were discussing this morning and the one that they're going to be visiting tomorrow. What's going to be his message? What might happen next in terms of SADC's engagement with the Zimbabwean authority, whichever it is at the moment, because it's not quite clear who's in charge.
Absolutely. You know, with the role of SADC, I'm glad that you're bringing in the regional / international dimension to this issue. Because in as much as I know, having spoken to many of my colleagues in Zimbabwe, some of them, you know, on social media sending me messages, you know, about the fact that they dislike, you know, the role of, you know, SADC and the African Union. But the fact of the matter, Peter, is that Zimbabwe is an inalienable, indivisible part of the African Union, is a member of the international community at the United Nations as well as in SADC. And to that extent, if there's any instability that happens, you know, in Zimbabwe, clearly, you know, this is a matter for SADC to be very concerned about, as we have seen with, you know, the SADC leaders going to Angola just a few hours ago. And so, you are right. I would, you know, guess that, you know, when the leaders were speaking in Angola, it was a question of probably going to speak to, you know, President Mugabe to get the clarity as to what his next move would be, whether he's listening to the Zimbabweans, you know, increasing echo that he should go, and generally that to ensure that there will not be, you know, a military coup d'etat or an unconstitutional removal of the sitting president in SADC, you know, by force of arms, clearly which goes against the grain of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, as well as the African Union, you know, principles and charters. So to that extent, yes, SADC still has to engage, you know, the Zimbabweans. Of course, now that President Mugabe has clearly, you know, resigned and is now gone, they will now have to engage with the incoming leadership. You are right. Currently, there might be a seemingly power vacuum, but the state is still very much intact. And so I think they will just need to engage the Zimbabweans to find out and locate that, you know, transient or transitory source of power to be able to engage with the Zimbabweans as to what should be done next. But I suppose that it is a question of going to Zimbabwe, not as people that are going to tell the Zimbabweans what to do, because clearly this is a Zimbabwean project, first and foremost, before it becomes a regional and continental project. So to that extent, they will have to listen to the Zimbabwean people and respect their, you know, constitutional and parliamentary prerogatives before proclaiming on anything thereafter.
Professor Kealeboga Maponya, thank you very, very much indeed for your insights on these remarkable events that have been taking place in Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe is no longer the president of Zimbabwe. He's resigned today, and the streets of Harare and other parts of the country and other Zimbabweans in the diaspora are celebrating the news. Tabile?
Thank you, Peter. Now we're joined in studio by Mark Bafo of the African Diaspora Forum. Mark, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, you've seen the visuals throughout Peter's interview, excitement all around in Zimbabwe, and perhaps the rest of the world, your take on that?
People are celebrating today. Today, we could say that it is an Independence Day in Zimbabwe. That's what people were looking, some Zimbabweans were looking for, and they've been waiting for 37 years. When we see the celebrations on the streets of Zimbabwe, if you see the celebrations currently in Johannesburg, you see that people are free. People have hope now. There is a hope for peace. There is a hope for electoral reform. There is hope for policy reformulation. And there is hope for the Zimbabweans on the ground, the people who are coming from that country. And if you take the example of South Africa, the many Zimbabweans who are coming here is because they were oppressed in that country. Some of us are surprised when in that country people were using the word democracy. There isn't democracy in Zimbabwe. People were struggling. When you belong to an opposition, you cannot have a word. People were oppressed. Human rights were denied to some people in that part of our continent. And today, there is hope. People can embrace each other now. And that's what we saw. And when you see the discussion, and I want to use this opportunity to greet and salute the millions of Zimbabweans, they show their political maturity. because for them to be patient. Yesterday after 12, when the president didn't resign, we were asking ourselves what could be the next move, because this is somebody who was leading the country for 37 years. He knows the in and out of that country. So you're asking yourself, are we going to see, for example, the same scenario happen in West Africa, in a country like Ivory Coast? And we lost about 3,000 people were killed. So you were asking yourself, is this what going to happen in Zimbabwe? You were asking yourself. But today, it was a relief. I think the president, at last, he took the right move because he could see that he was de-associated from the people. And his own political party rejected him at last. So he saw it, he felt it, and I think that's why he resigned.
Mark, it seems like there's a lot of elements here which we've seen play out over the past few weeks, but also the past few days as well. The theme that resonates, though, is that of hope. And you mentioned that a lot, and saying that, you know, the people who are in Zimbabwe have hope now, but the people that are also outside of Zimbabwe have hope. You interact a lot on the ground with Zimbabweans. Let's look at the differences between the sentiments of the people on the ground there in Zimbabwe at this point in time and the way forward, but also the ones that are in other countries like South Africa.
Well, people were running away. People who came from that country to other parts of our continent, and particularly in South Africa, is because they could not feel the country. They didn't have that hope. And that's what is open today, and what they will embrace today. We were from last week, Wednesday, to today, Tuesday, almost a week, what we saw in our office.
Mark, I just want to come in there because there's a lot going on in the country at the moment. Let's now cross to Pretoria, where our reporter Sipho Stirman is standing by outside the Zimbabwean embassy to get a sense of what is going on there after President Robert Mugabe's sudden resignation earlier.
Well, welcome to Pretoria, sunny side, here in the Pretoria CBD, where hundreds of Zimbabwean nationals and other nationals from African countries have gathered to celebrate the news this evening that former President Robert Mugabe has resigned. Now, what we are seeing here is that it's not only just Zimbabwean nationals, but it's also other foreign nationals that have come here in solidarity with Zimbabwean nationals. It is getting a bit hectic there. If maybe they can show you the scenes. It's celebrations all around. The Zimbabwean nationals saying they've waited for a long time to be here. You can see the excitement is reaching a climax point. Many Zimbabwean nationals had been waiting for this day and for this moment, and maybe we can just look around here. They've shut down the street here in Sunnyside. It's totally closed as many Zimbabweans continue to celebrate. Maybe we can talk to one. Maybe you can talk to us. Talk to us about how you're feeling today. Can you talk to us about that?
Feeling very happy, man, very great. As you can see today, it's a happy invitation to all Zimbabweans. And I'm celebrating the independence. I was born in 1991. I couldn't even sing, but today.
All right. Well, as you can see that there are many celebrations and it's getting a little bit out of hand here. But the main message is that all Zimbabwean nationals are celebrating. They're happy. How are you feeling?
We are so happy. But what happened tonight? That Mugabe is out.
All right. Well, it's now back to you in studio. It's all celebrations around here in Sunnyside. Back to you.
Very much, Sipho. That was our reporter, Sipho Stirman, who's in Pretoria. As you can see, a lot of excitement and celebration there, which we'll probably see taking place throughout the evening as well as the rest of the week, probably. I'm still joined in studio by Mark Buffo of the African Diaspora Forum. Mark, let's go back to what we've seen happening. Another sentiment that we saw the moment the coup started or the army took over in Zimbabwe was that SADC's reaction was a little weak. And I know as the African Diaspora Forum, you haven't always been a fan of SADC and some of the things that they do and some of the work they do in the region. How did you feel about their reaction to what happened in Zimbabwe and what's currently happening right now?
Look, this time I think once we heard about the situation in Zimbabwe, President Zuma, as the chair of SADC, appointed a delegation already to Zimbabwe and also went for a talk, I mean, among the leaders of the region, which is a very quick thing, and we use the opportunity to salute that. What we didn't see and what we have been realizing in the region is that any decision is not that clear to every citizen of this part of Africa. SADC takes some decisions which are loose. We don't feel the decision of SADC as if they don't want to talk about real issues.
That's the case. Why are they seemingly almost indecisive or ambiguous in some of the decisions that they make?
Look, because maybe they're more interested to talk about their mates than to talk about the people at the ground. I think that's a question that the region has to see and to touch on, because the millions of Zimbabweans were waiting for this freedom, where they were actually watching the region to decide, but they couldn't see that. They say that they're talking, they're having some meetings, but there is no outcome. They go to a meeting to decide to the next meeting. And this is very, very strange. I think SADC need to be more precise on their decisions, and they must send the decision back to the ground, and that's what we are expecting from them.
And I think it's quite clear that the most important people in this context are clearly the people of Zimbabwe. And something that we were chatting about a little bit earlier on, my colleague and I, Peter Ndoro, was how, you know, a few weeks ago we saw rallies taking place where people were there in support of Mugabe, saying that he's going to be our president. This 95-year-old is going to be our president again come the elections next year. And it almost seemed as though people were forced to be there. What were you thinking about those rallies taking place and that support and then the sudden coup that we saw?
Look, I think this is happening in our continent in many countries where people organize what we call the political crowd.
A paid crowd.
A paid crowd. They go show them, and even they take these pictures to show the president, you see your support. And that's why, for instance, when the president got a deadline of 12 yesterday, until this afternoon, he didn't, and until this, today, he didn't resign.
Are you saying that it's because all along he actually believed that people wanted him to remain president? Definitely.
He thought he has the support, although his political party recalled him. Look, he still believed that he could be the president of a country because of the support that the few people, either in the media, they were showing him and so on. So the reality is that you were so disconnected from your own people that you no longer understand your country. And that's what happened to him.
Now, speaking of the people, on the streets of Harare, Zimbabweans did not hide their emotions at all in reaction to the president's resignation. Let's take a look.
Zimbabwe has been the worst country in Africa, and Robert Mugabe's rules and laws have been so oppressive to us. We hope for the new government which is coming will be different totally, and we are expecting new blood in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe will never be a colony again, as he used to say, Mugabe. We are no longer interested in Mugabe. This is history. We are celebrating and we are overjoyed. As Zimbabweans, we say glory be to God.
It's gone. We thank God for everything. Hallelujah.
Today is just another day. that we never expected as Zimbabweans. We were looking forward to this day, and all I can say is Mugabe is now officially gone. I'm a Zimbabwean citizen, and I believe in a new Zimbabwe coming very, very soon. In fact, the new Zimbabwe that we have been waiting for ages, for 37 years, is right here. We have it now. I say Viva Zimbabwe, Viva Zimbabwe. To all the Zimbabweans out there, I hope you are celebrating this day. This is a new day, an Independence Day to us all.
When I give birth to my child, he won't or she won't know the evil that Robert Mugabe visited on this motherland of ours. We love Zimbabwe. At one point we loved that guy, but then he capitulated on his promises. We say no longer to creating a system called Robert Mugabeism. No more.
When elections could not get rid of Robert Mugabe, the army did it, and they did it with professionalism, and you are proud of them!
Mark, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I guess a good way to wrap this up would be to look at a way forward. We know that Emmerson Mnangagwa has been tipped to take the top position at this point in time. Your sentiments on him specifically?
Look, I think the biggest challenge now we have is for the new leadership to show that they want to set a new beginning, and they should be able to embrace all Zimbabwe and make all voice count in that particular country. They should be able to set a new policy, reformulate the policy of that country, electoral reform, and make all the voices of that country count, and that could give hope to the Zimbabweans. And I think Zimbabwe should be now open to investment, being in an investment-friendly country for people to be able to work and rebuild that beautiful country.
Mark, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. That was Mark Bafo of the African Diaspora Forum. It's now back to Peter.
Tabile, thank you very much indeed. And yeah, we continue with our conversations on this historic day. 37 years later, Robert Mugabe resigned from office. Nobody thought that would ever come, but he has. He had said that he would continue and he would only leave if his people had asked him to. But it seems that that day came sooner than he thought. I'm now joined from our studio in Pretoria by Dr. Martin Rupia, a retired Zimbabwean Lieutenant Colonel, and with me here in studio we have Tamuka Chirambowa, who's from the University of Johannesburg. Gentlemen, a very good evening to you. Thank you very much for joining us. So let me start with you, Mr. Chirambowa, here in Johannesburg. You're seeing the images in Harare, you're seeing some of the reactions, and people would be asking, and they might be confused. 3 weeks ago, we saw stadiums full of Zanu-PF supporters endorsing Dr. Mugabe, endorsing Robert Mugabe. How is it that we can have scenes like this now?
I think basically what you have to understand, this is not uncommon what has happened in Zimbabwe. Look at the fall of Mobutu, when he had a massive rally in Kinshasa 3 days before Kinshasa was stormed. This has happened with all dictators, but you have to understand that 3 weeks ago, by then the army had not made it explicitly clear that it had withdrawn support from President Mugabe. And remember, President Mugabe's role, I mean, I've argued before here and others, was that it was simply hinged on the military. It was not by popular legitimacy. So it was simply because by then it had not quite come out. But the moment the military came out clear that it had gone different ways with Robert Mugabe. You even saw, I mean, last weekend on Saturday when people went in their thousands, it showed that they had shifted. So I think the military has been the decisive factor in this war, in the fall of Robert Mugabe, rather than just the people alone.
All right, let's go to Pretoria, where Dr. Martin Rupia is. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Your reactions and your thoughts. It's been a pretty dramatic week. We thought that he'd be forced out of power after he failed to resign on Sunday evening, but he resigned.
Yes, thanks, Peter, for inviting us. I feel slightly embarrassed, you know, in my former career as a military colonel. But anyway, that's another story. What we now have is we have to put on our thinking caps to provide, relief and, and to respond to the high expectations of our people who have been oppressed and impoverished for so long. You can see almost an analogy of what we did in 1980, celebrating independence, and then we were disappointed. We cannot afford to disappoint Zimbabweans on the, for the second time. So although the succession is really a ruling party Zanu-PF process, once that is done, we are hoping in the next 2 days, then we hope the colleagues will think much broader and bring in all stakeholders to try and work on the recovery that we see young people, young talent, being wasted in terms of the political elite that has just been removed from office.
What do you think happened since Sunday? Because Sunday we thought he was going to resign and he didn't. But a lot of things must have happened. He tried to call a cabinet meeting this morning and no one showed up apparently except maybe two faces. We also saw Kenneth Kaunda come in from Zambia, perhaps to have a chat with him. Do you think it was a combination of all of these factors that eventually he just lost the fight?
Certainly the man was not prepared to go. He put up a very good fight. But I think what has happened is a series of incremental positions. First, of course, his own party recalling him, followed by an impeachment process. I'm sure he did not expect all of this to go through without popular support. We also must remember the wide march on Saturday, in which all shades of political opinion and stakeholders, churches, youths, and others, and we have an ongoing strike at the University of Zimbabwe. The youth are also expressing not only to get the president out, but they're also protesting against the fake degree. So all these things have come together, and during the impeachment process, the Speaker of the House, Jacob Mdenda, then received a letter of resignation, demonstrating that what President Lungu, I think, had done in sending former President Kaunda to have a very serious discussion with Mugabe had worked. So it's a series of the combinations. But I think in this euphoria, we have to begin to put on our thinking caps. How do we take Zimbabwe forward? How do we recover? How do you provide hope?
Okay, Mr. Chiramboa, how do we start that process? Right now we're busy wondering who's going to be installed as president. Is Mpoko president at the moment, as the constitution might suggest? What happens next, and then what must happen to stabilize things?
I think basically, if you had listened to Zanu-PF Chief Whip Lovemore Matuke, he made it clear that within 24 to 48 hours they would have, Mnangagwa would be head of state. So basically, because this thing has been solved within Zanu-PF, what it actually means, Zanu-PF, when the constitution is read in accordance with the sixth schedule, to the constitution, it is supposed to forward a candidate. And if Zanu-PF, the moment they forward, their candidate to say Emmerson Mnangagwa is going to, it means he's automatically going to take over as president and run. So the issue of Mnangagwa coming in now is now almost a fighter assembly. But basically, I think what is fundamental is when going forward, like what Dr. Rupia is saying, that we need to put on our thinking heads and avoid the euphoria and the same mistakes of 1980 and thinking that they are messiahs in politics. So basically, for me, the one thing which is quite critical is the issue of transitional justice and national healing. There has to be a clear program on this, how it's going to be resolved and taken, and it has to be an inclusive process, because there are unresolved questions. Going far back, okay, if you're a war veteran, the war veteran, they talk about the liberation struggle, the atrocities. Then you've got also what happened in Matabeleland, in the Matabeleland and Midlands province, that's the southern part of Zimbabwe, the Gukurahundi massacre. Then we've have got the political violence, in particular after 2000.
Right. You know what, I'm going to pause for a second. I do want to come back to this, and we'll continue our conversation with you and Dr. Rupia just now. But we must go to Harare now, because Griselda is still on the streets there, and there's still celebrations taking place there. Griselda?
We don't have data.
Hello, Griselda, can you hear us?
We're live from the Harare International Convention Center. We're bringing you more reaction on the resignation of President Robert Mugabe, the long-standing leader of Zimbabwe. More reaction from ordinary citizens and also from those within the governing party, Zanu-PF. Let's chat now to one of the political commissars of the Zanu-PF Women's League, Angela Nyenyai, who's also saying that she's welcoming the resignation of President Robert Mugabe. You'd also recall that the now ex-First Lady of Zimbabwe as well, Grace Mugabe, has been at the helm of the Zanu-PF Women's League, and subsequently, due to the utterances that we've seen her make with regard to senior leaders within Zanu-PF, she then was also expelled from Zanu-PF and also removed as the president of the Zanu-PF Women's League. Let's join now Angela Nyenyai, who will chat to us. Mayor Angela Nyenyai, thank you very much for your time this evening. An historic moment for Zimbabwe, for the Women's League. Grace Mugabe has been removed as the president. Let's talk a bit about that. And first of all, the reaction then to the sacking of Grace Mugabe as the president of the Women's League.
Grace Mugabe is a menace to the public, especially to the Women's League of Zimbabwe. She was not friendly. She was cruel to Women's League. She was full of vulgar words. She was not, she didn't have love at her heart for people. She was always on stage scolding people, especially Emmerson Mnangagwa, our current president now. People are now happy because of the removal of President Robert Mugabe and Grace Mugabe. I think people are going now to be happy for the rest of their lives in Zimbabwe because they have been removed for this, their stumbling block.
Some would argue as well that you as senior leaders within the Zanu-PF Women's League did not stand up at the right time, because in many of the Zimbabweans that we spoke to, the argument is that the now ex-president of Zimbabwe had allowed his wife, Grace Mugabe, to take decisions on his behalf. Do you believe, as the Women's League, you stood up at the right time to arrest the situation within Zimbabwe?
Yes, I think that's correct, because especially when women are being elected for elections, there are some guys who stand up against women, especially in Magunje constituency where I reside. I was once in the elections for 2013 elections. Then there was this guy called Godfrey Gandawa who is involved in a scandal for he's the deputy minister for education and tertiary education. He wanted him out because he's
but ma'am, the question is, did you as the Women's League of Zanu-PF stand up when all of this had been taking place? You are senior political figures within the Zanu-PF Women's League. Did you stand up at all, or did you allow the situation to continue?
People were afraid of Grace because she was coming. But now that they're seeing where the wind is going, they're now standing up in arms against it.
What are your hopes for Zimbabwe moving forward, man? We understand as well that Emmerson Mnangagwa will be sworn in as the president on Thursday. Those are just some of the reports that we are getting as well. Your hopes for Zimbabwe?
People are looking forward for prosperity, love and peace in Zimbabwe. And the industries are going to be opened. That's what we believe now.
Thank you very much, ma'am, there for your time. One of the senior political commissars within the Zanu-PF Women's League, who are saying that this is a new time for Zimbabwe. She doesn't believe that them as senior figures within the Zanu-PF Women's League did not stand up at the right time, saying that the now president of the Zanu-PF Women's League, Grace Mugabe, did not allow anyone to speak up. Those are her words, and are saying now they believe that this is a time for them to take charge and a refreshing, perhaps, Zanu-PF Women's League to be formed as well again. But peace and prosperity is what is resonating throughout Harare at this time, as both political figures as well as ordinary people on the streets are saying that the future of Zimbabwe begins here today. Well, just news that we've also just got in from the South African presidency as well is that while there's no confirmation of the time that President Jacob Zuma will be arriving here, we understand that he will be arriving with the Angolan president. That was the early arrangement, as we understand, from the South African presidency. But all eyes now on that very important moment for the people of Zimbabwe, where they say that Emmerson Mnangagwa will take his rightful place as the president of this country. But certainly more beyond that, beyond the celebrations on the streets as well, one would really want to see how Zimbabwe itself moves forward and how it will resuscitate not just the politics of this country, but as well as the economy, of which these people are saying needs to take this country forward in order to create jobs and to resuscitate a health system that has long collapsed, as well as education within this country. Those are some of the critical aspects, after all the pomp and ceremony is done, that the people of Zimbabwe will hope are some of the pressing issues that are attended to. Griselda Lewis reporting live from the Harare International Convention Center.
Griselda, thank you very much indeed. That's Griselda. She was talking to a lady representing the Zanu-PF Women's League. And to be fair and honest, when we talk about Zimbabwe's history and liberation struggle, the women were not spectators. They fought hard, and they fought alongside their men and counterparts. And one comes to mind is Joyce Mujuru, and her struggle name was Taurairopa, which meant spilt blood. And legend has it that she shot down a plane during the struggle using a mortar. So they've played their role, and I would wonder what role she would be playing next. And I've still got as guests Dr. Martin Rupia in Pretoria and Tamuka Chirambowa, who's here in studio. So Women's League spoke, and I think a lot of people don't understand the fear that existed in Zimbabwe and persisted for such a long time, that at times paralyzed people to a point that they could take no action.
Yeah, I mean, there was excessive fear in Zimbabwe, and I think it was pervasive. And for you to understand this, you have to understand the creature that Robert Mugabe created. He even within the security forces themselves, even you see when this so-called coup was undertaken, they had to lock down the police. You heard from Chris Mutangwa's press statement yesterday where he was speaking about the support unit being turned into paramilitary, because Mugabe was in even the security forces to spy on each other. So he was playing them like a game of, like pawns on a board of chess. So basically it created a system of fear and patronage.
All right, Dr. Rupia, what does happen to characters like Joyce Mujuru going forward now? Because we haven't heard from her today, but it will be interesting to get her thoughts, because this was a long-time comrade that she was deputy president to for a long time as well, but fought alongside for so many years, returned to Zimbabwe alongside. There must be disappointment and joy at the same time.
Peter, what we now know is that some of the things are historical. Remember Chris Mutangwa indicating that Joyce Mujuru actually did not shoot, the helicopter. So maybe we want to move away from the myth-making that Zanu-PF has been, carrying out. We need in the first 100 days, to look at the bad policies that this government was, the previous government was following. And secondly, we must begin to look at the resources that are there. And thirdly, to look at the delivery of services. Government can only deliver with credible institutions. And it is those three, for me, that we must hit the ground running and not necessarily begin to isolate characters and other people, but to be serious, to deliver and provide our people with concrete relief and also concrete opportunities to take them out of poverty. The level that Zimbabwe has degenerated in the region amongst the 15 SADC countries is really quite sad. And I think the brains exist and the enthusiasm is available to take ourselves out of the situation that we have been degraded into.
You talk about institutions, and a lot of work is going to have to be done, but I wonder if Zanu-PF can do that. And I'm thinking about the Auditor General's Office, I'm thinking about the judiciary, I'm thinking about CIO and the Secret Intelligence Agency. So can Zanu-PF reform those that have served them so well?
It is not possible for Zanu-PF to undertake this task on their own. You need to create a stakeholder platform that brings in all the Zimbabweans, both at home and abroad, and also includes external actors, including SADC, South Africa, and other players, the African Union, to come and assist. I mean, you have an election commission that is completely lost the confidence of the ordinary Zimbabweans. You have a banking structure, treasury, in which the corruption and accessing of state assets was rampant. So you need to bring confidence to all of those. But that cannot happen if you don't have a platform that is really sitting and thinking through what new policies we must bring in, what bad policies exist that we must discard, and also align ourselves to SADC. Many of the policies adopted by Zimbabwe, almost without, with impunity, were against the SADC guidelines and principles. And it's about time that we begin to join the 300+ million people in SADC and become a normal nation that is prosperous, hardworking, and also providing hope and a destiny for our own people.
Mr. Chirembo, what do the opposition parties do in a situation like this? We've had this momentous occasion, which they didn't contribute a tremendous amount to seeing, but there is a momentum and there's an opportunity maybe. What do they do?
I think, first of all, one thing which I might want to put across to you is that we are where we are because of the opposition. I think the opposition has played a significant role in trying to erode, Robert Mugabe's role. And I think one thing which should be alive to, even the arguments which were being used by the military and even for the Mnangagwa faction, some of the arguments which they have been now fronting, and the policies. These are policies which were primarily being pushed for or advocated by the opposition when it came in 2000. So I think the opposition has played a fantastic role, but it's usually always so easy to praise the number 9 or Cristiano Ronaldo when he scores the ball, but those were in the background, they are never seen. Yeah. I mean, this has been a marathon. Yes, the changes come from the military, but let's go back where it started. But I think going forward, the opposition needs to go back to its constituents and rejuvenate, because when you look at Zimbabwe's economy, it has been reconfigured. It's no longer that Zimbabwe where it was a highly formalized economy. You have got close to almost 100,000 new farmers who are actually on the farm. Like if you go into the tobacco industry, we had about 90,000 small-scale tobacco farmers, contributing to close to 1 billion, which was, $1 billion US dollars in terms of tobacco earnings. So that is actually a class that is emerging. And if you look at the Environmental Management Report of 2012, it talks of close to 500,000 artisanal miners and this the so-called Makorokoza, so what they call Zama in South Africa. So when you look at this, last year alone they contributed like 40% of the gold which went to Fidelity printers, and as of this it is a reason. And you also have the Zimbabwean diaspora contributing close to 1 billion US. That is as of last year. So these are significant forms of classes that have been forming, which were not there when the opposition started. And I think the opposition needs to go back, do its homework, and see how it can appeal to this. And as well as the millenniums, who are forming like now 66-point-something% of the population. So I think there are opportunities for the opposition. You can't write it off, because the opposition has run a good race, and this is a marathon.
So what happens to things like bond notes and the financial structures that have been in place?
I think the first thing which you have to know is that the bond notes had already run into a crisis. It was fictitious money. It was bagged by money. The retail gross settlement system, whereby the RBZ would just punch in money. So the first thing before even we talk about the bond notes is addressing our Public Financial Management Act, whereby you give Parliament its powers to be able to monitor. And it also speaks to the issue of removing the Reserve Bank from doing quasi-fiscal or the activities and giving back power to Treasury. And then we have proper policies. And I would think what we need to look at now is it proper for us to return the Zim dollar or not? But if you talk with most Zimbabweans, they are not comfortable with the Zim dollar. So money is not only just about production, but there's also the issue of confidence. So for now, I wouldn't say the bond. I think removing the bond note will be the best thing to do. But then what we need to do is for those who had bond notes and money in their accounts, what do we do with that?
Dr. Rupia, does Emmerson Mnangagwa bring in the opposition right away to somehow, I suppose, endear himself to the general population?
You see, Peter, one of the things I said in terms of thinking caps is that the tobacco industry is going nowhere. We need to, in the next 10, 15 years, the tobacco industry may not be viable. And so we need people that think long-term, that think strategic, but also create opportunities that are sustainable. As we speak, if the president in 2 days was to take over, the first things that he must do is to create, I think, a platform of think tank community who will advise him on how best to go. The previous government had no links whatsoever with the think tank community. All of them accused of being, agents of imperialism, regime change, agents, etc. But we have the first opportunity, I think, after 1980, to really make Zimbabwe work and to work properly as part of the global but modern economy.
How much time do you think it'll take to reconstitute Zimbabwe?
You will be surprised. In my view, within 36 months, we may begin to have the fundamentals in place, but they must be the correct fundamentals. Zimbabwe has a huge capacity of human resource. It has huge resources which have been abused, corrupted and sold without benefit. So you start with the low-hanging fruit: agriculture, tourism, recovering the infrastructure, etc. It's a long story, but I think within 3 years, Zimbabwe is going to surprise a lot of people. There is huge potential for that country to come back to the glory days of what it was.
Do you agree, Mr. Chirambo? I'm Mr. Investor. I'm sitting in London right now. what decision process am I going through right now?
Yeah, I think what you have to look at, there is some kind of optimism, particularly if you go business, because even the person who is started to come in, Emmerson Mnangagwa, he of late is the one who has been conducting, running the show, while President Mugabe was in the background. And even when you look, even people like Finance Minister Patrick Chinamasa, I remember when he tried to suspend payment of bonuses last year, he was vetoed by President Mugabe while he was at a rally. And they'd also started the Lima debt realignment process, which was also like normalizing relations with the West and finances. So in terms of being pro-business, I think Mnangagwa has actually been trying to do that, and this is one of the trump card which has been using. And I think his only question comes particularly on the democratic question. But I do share optimism that if the correct fundamentals are put in place, Zimbabwe can take off. But I think that can only happen if the people who are going to come into power now, they are not driven by zero-sum game politics or a winner takes it all. There is a need to realize that what we have gone through has been painful, has been a difficult period, and there's a need to build a one unified Zimbabwe and avoid this politics of the winner takes all. And I think once we do that, Zimbabwe can take off. And also one thing which you have to take note of, Zimbabwe has always been an agro-based industry. It has been an agro-based industry. So like Dr. Rupia noted, agriculture would be a very fundamental key point, and that would necessarily speak to the issue of land reform, to say, what do you do to people who are given land? The multiple farm owners, because there are some people who are given land who are producing, there are those who are not producing, but there's still the issue of solving the issue of exchange value and use value, particular issues around property rights. Where are we going? Are we still going to remain with the 99-year leases which are unbankable and offer letters, or we are going purely capitalistic or neoliberal? So these are some of the things which need to be addressed to say, how do you make Zimbabwe's land to work again? Because if Zimbabwe is to industrialize, it will be from agriculture.
Okay, Dr. Rupia, final thought from you before we say goodbye?
I think we need to provide and continue to journey with the people that are celebrating on the streets. And within a very short period, provide very practical examples of new thinking. The old thinking that has been in place has really destroyed hope, it has destroyed potential, and it has also removed potential external actors who could assist and work with us going forward. So I think this is now the time for us to start on a new slate, but really to think Zimbabwean and to provide a platform that all of us can begin to work together going forward.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Martin Rupia, academic but former Lieutenant Colonel in the Zimbabwe National Army, and to you, Mr. Tamuka Chiramboa, thank you very much indeed for joining us from the University of Johannesburg. Thanks so much for your time.
Okay, welcome.
Okay, now, in the meantime, our reporter Manqoba Mqunu was in the streets of Hillbrow in Johannesburg, and he was getting a sense of the mood here. Celebrations taking place everywhere, it seems.
Unprecedented scenes here in the streets of Hillbrow today, as hundreds of Zimbabwean nationals have come out here in celebration. They are singing and dancing, really excited about the developments that are happening in their country. Many of them saying that finally they are free, and they are carrying various placards reading Zim free at last. And as you can see, this street, this particular stretch of street has now been
Botswana. So this is a new break for us, Zimbabweans, and I think I am ready to go back home.
We want Abelungu back. We want to say Sevenza Abelungu. Want people to come back, guys. We are not fighting with you. We love you. One unit. Karate blue.
It's a day in history for many of these Zimbabwean nationals who say that finally they are free at last. I'm Robert Mugabe, SABC News in Hillbrook, Johannesburg.
Now, still on Zimbabwe, we're now joined in studio by David Moore, a politics professor from the University of Johannesburg, as well as Advocate Dalim Ofu of the EFF. Prof, Advocate, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Good evening.
Now, let me start with you, Prof. What does a Zimbabwe without Robert Mugabe look like? Can we even imagine it at this point, or is there still a lot of excitement and celebration?
37 years. So well more than half of the population, I'm sure, were born after 1980. I can remember, I'm 62. And I went to Zimbabwe first in 1984 to do my PhD thesis. So I can't imagine it even without Robert Mugabe. It was the man and the state were these combined essences. Sabelo Ndlovu Gachini has developed this concept of Mugabeism. Is there even an ideology? You read some of the writings of some of the journalists and the intellectuals. They speak that language, kind of a very academic, convoluted language. It's almost a discourse which is Mugabeism. And now, well, it's been one man changed for another. How different is that man? Is there still a Mugabeist essence that is traced all the way through Zimbabwean society? I think it can change. I think this moment is a moment of real change.
Advocate, 37 years. I was speaking to my colleague Peter Ndoro earlier on, and he was saying that he lived through this. He has seen a younger Mugabe. A lot of us haven't. I mean, we were born, I won't say when I was born, but I mean, your take on what Zimbabwe will look like post-Mugabe?
Well, for people of my generation, it's unimaginable a Zimbabwe without Robert Mugabe. And I think that that's a very important thing. Even if whether Mugabe was a good leader or a bad leader or indifferent, just the mere idea of having one leader for 37 years means that the country is going to have to go through some fundamental changes and adjustments of style, of how things are done, just the whole thing. So the new leadership has got a challenge in its hands. And I think that insofar as this whole thing was really driven by Zanu-PF, whether it manifested in the politicians or the soldiers, but it was really a party-driven exercise. The most important thing is that it has been a peaceful transition. And I'm hoping that the new leadership, nobody knows what's going to happen. Are they going to call a new election? Are they going to do a government of national unity? What? Those are the options that I think the new leadership of Zanu-PF, which is the ruling party, are going to have to ponder. But whatever the options that they take, it's going to be something quite fundamentally different. As David says, half of the population, if somebody was 10 years old in 1980, today they are almost 50 years old. And they've never seen any other leader except for Robert Mugabe.
And that puts it into so much context. Let's look at the politics of this entire thing, Prof. I mean, we mentioned now that the whole thing took place within and around the Zanu-PF itself. What does this mean for politics as a whole on the African continent? Because there are many leaders who continue to cling to power.
Well, I think it was interesting because it was a coup that wasn't quite a coup.
Very neat.
Very neat. Well, it actually became very complex at times. Chiwenga, the guy who made his speech on the last Monday night, said this is all internal. We might step in. Then the next day, he's rebuffed by the Politburo. They say, no, that's treasonous. So then they have to go to Plan B, which is more of the real coup. One person was killed, an Israeli security guard for the Minister of Finance, Strombo. But look at Saturday. Look at the streets who were full of civil society activists, whites, blacks, women, men, young people, old people, poor people, rich people. And that, I think, was because, I think as Tamuka was saying, there has been 15 years, almost 20 years of a democratic push that has pushed ZANU and pushed society as a whole into something much more democratic. So even with this expression that Mnangagwa said today, he said, well, I can't go because it's not safe for me to go. He says, Mugabe, you better go because the people have spoken. And when the people speak, it's the same as God speaking. Now, that's more democratic than Grace Mugabe, who would say, God has anointed Robert Mugabe, this idol, this you know, one-man thing. So that even at that level, there's a little bit of a discourse of more democracy within Zanu-PF. And I think so many people in Zanu-PF have been living in this fear. You know, the CIO, the intelligence, nobody being able to speak up because you don't know if the person in the office next door is you know, a spy or not. And even the 2008 election, when so many people were killed after that runoff election in March, and then there had to be a presidential runoff after Shangarai actually won 47, right? At least officially. He actually won a lot more than that. So many stolen elections. But there were even ZANU people killed because some ZANU people voted ZANU in the parliamentary election. Remember, there were many elections going on at the same time. So in the parliamentary election, some people would vote for a ZANU-PF candidate but vote for Shangarai as a president. It was known, and those people were singled out and tortured or beaten up or killed. So these very subtle political, this fear that was pervasive throughout society will go. It'll have to go, and the military can't put a handle on it. As a matter of fact, they were getting worried, even as of yesterday. They sent out this document telling the students, don't go on strike, don't have a fees must fall sort of thing. Study. And so they were worried that civil society would move faster than they could. So that might have been part of the reason why there was a settlement. Now, who knows why this settlement came about, but we'll find that out in the next few days.
I want to stay with what the Prof mentioned about the people having spoken. Now, why did it take them so long? Is it simply a case of fear?
Yeah, certainly fear played a big role. I mean, you can't just have a population that, you know, a few months ago was swearing by Mugabe, all transformed within a matter of a week. I mean, there are people who, I mean, when the EFF, for example, called for Mugabe to step down in February this year, there was a fellow called Psychology something, who, I mean, I don't think there's a single insult that he didn't hurl at us. Yeah. So where is he now? I'm sure he's also celebrating. So, you know, one must not be naive about this. Yeah. And it's important that it is an internal party thing, because, you know, if we get ahead of ourselves and think this is Uhuru and liberation and so on, we might be shocked by what is happening, because these are people who really have been Mugabe supporters. The question that you asked earlier about what it means for the continent, I think it's very significant, because in a way, this is a generational thing. The generation of the so-called liberators and the strong men and so on in the tradition of Nyerere, Nkrumah, Mugabe, Machel and so on. This was probably the last person who represented that generation of liberators. So it might well be that the real change here is that young people of Africa are now going to be taking over. Obviously, the current leadership of Zanu-PF, which is already in its 60s and 70s already, is probably going to be the midwives of the real transition. But across the whole continent, I think there's a much bigger change that's going to come in the next 10 or so years, of a new generation of leadership, a more, more urgency and deliberateness in bringing more radical type of changes. Because this generation that brought so-called political freedom has done its part, and we now probably are going to be moving to the next phase. So this is also significant for that reason.
Now, our reporters have been on the ground for most of the day. Some are in Zimbabwe, some here in Johannesburg, actually, speaking to people on the ground, Zimbabwean nationals, saying, we are hopeful. You know, we are hopeful of a better tomorrow. Yeah. Today is a new day. It's a better day. What happens beyond the celebrations? Because like with anything else in life, the excitement and the celebratory mood will wear off. Yeah. But people want to see now tangible things, real results. You know, let's speak about the economy. Let's speak about socio-economic issues that the people of Zimbabwe have faced for many, many years. Prof, you can take this one first.
Sure, although I'd like to stick in on the political question for one more minute. Generation 40, that was a new generation. Well, you know, 45, 50. Jonathan Moyle, the famous information minister who was squashing all it. And that was squashed. They made it, they really tried. They pushed too far too fast, and that's why Mnangagwa came back and the military came in. I would have more faith in the generation slightly under that. We have
that makes sense.
Yeah, sort of 10 diabetes generation, that age group. The students like Tamuka, who was, they were hurt very badly when they were demonstrating against Zanu-PF and worked very hard for the MDC. Now they're a little skeptical of the politics of, you know, elite pacting, let's put it that way. Anyway, okay, what should happen within the next? This is something that international capital, or put it, you know, the World Bank, the IMF, the British, Mnangagwa is seen as a favorite of the British, very conservative economist. They were worried about another nosedive with these bond notes and these treasury bills and this electronic money, which was, so they were worried about a hyperinflationary spiral happening like it happened in 2008. So I think there were various parties around the world who were keen to see Mugabe go and keen to implement the sort of policies that Patrick Chinamasa, the finance minister last but one, who was going to the Lima meetings of the IMF and trying to strike deals, but they wouldn't trust Mugabe. In fact, Mugabe would dismiss any liberal economic formulations that some of these technocrats were trying to bring about. So that could happen in a big push. And of course, the shock therapy that Naomi Klein talks about when there's a crisis, the guardians of global capital come in and say, okay, you better fix it up right now while there's a honeymoon.
And I want us to come back to that in a moment. But now we're going to cross to our reporter, Sipho Stearman, who is in Pretoria, and he's standing outside the Zimbabwean embassy where we saw some celebrations earlier. I bet there's still more celebrations to go. Sipho?
Well, a very good evening to you once more and our viewers at home. We are still outside here in the streets of Sunnyside in Pretoria. Well, Sunnyside is often called the Hillbrow of Pretoria, and this is where we find a variety of foreign nationals who come from their various countries across the continent who live here. And of course, part of that community includes the Zimbabwean nationals who have gathered here to celebrate the news of former President Robert Mugabe's resignation. And if I can just step out of the shot here, you can see that they are still gathering out here, and some of them are saying they are going to be here till midnight and that they are not going away anytime soon. The police, of course, are keeping a close eye on events. It did get a bit tense earlier on, and I suppose it's because the Zimbabwean nationals, they are very excited. Many of them said that they never thought they would see the removal or the resignation of former President Robert Mugabe in their lifetime. So this is a moment they call it's a freedom day for them. They say they attained independence from the colonial government, but now this is freedom for their nation, and this will lead then to hopefully economic recovery, with many of them saying that they are tired of living in South Africa, making small money, or earning rather small salaries, and being called by all sorts of derogatory names. They're saying that their country has so much potential, and that they hope that the new incoming leadership will help revive the economy of Zimbabwe. But what we are also getting out here from the Zimbabwean nationals that I've spoken to, I was earlier on outside the Zimbabwean embassy, where I spoke to a couple of young people. They're saying that as much as they are happy with the resignation of Robert Mugabe, they still do not despise the man. Well, some of them say that they say he is still a national hero, but however he has overstayed his welcome. So you get a sense that there is a bit of forgiveness towards Mugabe that is coming through for some of the people spoken to, saying that he still is a national hero who overstayed his welcome in power, and now it's time for a new beginning. So that is the views we are getting on the ground. We will, of course, continue to cover the reactions here tomorrow for you, but from us here in Pretoria right now, it's back to you in studio.
celebrations taking place in Pretoria, but I can tell you right around the world, and America, London, you name it, everyone is celebrating the departure of Robert Mugabe. 37 years in power, and he never thought he would see this day coming. A few weeks ago, he was saying he was going to continue to serve the party because the people loved him, he said. Well, it seems that has changed somewhat. But that's it from me. You're in safe hands with Tabilesh, who's going to be taking you through the rest of this evening. But it's been interesting observing this historic day when President Robert Mugabe resigned from office. But we're going to continue with all of this live coverage on SABC 2. Good night from me.
Thank you very much, Peter. You keep speaking of excitement and you forget to mention how excited and happy you are. I have it on good authority that Peter is going home to celebrate as well. Don't take my word for it. Don't take my word for it. There he is. There he is.
You've outed
my
me.
favorite guy from Zimbabwe is the happiest guy ever. I'm happy with you. I'm
my
happy
bubble.
Now, I'm still joined in studio by Professor David Moore from the University of Johannesburg, as well as Advocate Zanu-PF. Now, we saw some reaction all around the day, and we're going to carry on with our discussion because before we went to Sipho Stirman a little earlier on, who's in Pretoria with those celebrations, we were speaking about, you know, going forward in Zimbabwe in terms of the socioeconomic challenges that we've seen the country face over the years. Prof, let's pick up where we left off.
Well, we have one of the poorest populations in the world now. Infrastructure is terrible. Schools are still bad. The university is not looking too bad. UNICEF put boreholes in the university. You know, a lot of the infrastructure has been done by donors, international agencies. So that stuff has to be really worked out. But I think, as I was saying, there's going to be this push for a neoliberal solution. The group that got out, the Generation 40 that went out, people like Patrick Jau, who is Mugabe's nephew, and said the guy will go out dying. He was, before he was Minister of Labor, which he is now, he was Minister of Indigenization. He had some of the most radical discourse, but it was again a very rhetorical sort of thing. This discursive formation that seems to occur in Zimbabwe is very interesting, and they had a lot of radical rhetoric. But I don't think it would have lasted, because they would have been, if they had taken power, they would have been hit by the same global forces, right? And I think, look, Delhi, what would the EFF do now if the EFF somehow got power? International capital, the big powers, China is, you know, it's no longer really communist. The pressure would be there. So there has to be a real delicate balance between social democracy, policies that will give people a basic, a decent life, a good start, you know, even that liberal discourse, equal opportunity, that means a lot of state intervention. How do you blend that with liberal politics, you know, freedom of expression and all that sort of stuff, which have been, for years and years and years, there's been this big gap in the language of Zimbabwean politics. Radical meant give people the land, but it didn't mean let trade unions associate and bargain, and didn't let civil society be free. And that language of freedom became linked with a neoliberal economic discourse. Those are going to have to come back together again, and this is a fundamental time in the global economy too. Everybody's got to do it. Zimbabwe can really start thinking, Zimbabweans can really start thinking, not just the sort of think tanks that Professor Rupia was talking about, which are from, you know, the IMF discourse, but radical policy thinking that is emanated from civil society and emanated from the trade unions. The trade unions are decimated now because there's no industry left, right? But there's been a long period from 1980 until they started really falling into nothing in the 2000s, of thinking, of intellectuals who have been thinking long and hard about how to create a much better, equitable future. So hopefully those voices will come to the fore, and we will get some really creative thinking instead of just the nostrums which you know, good governance, transparency. Everybody speaks the same language. It's like they've all gone to the same elocution school. We need a new elocution school in economic thinking. And I think it'll come.
Advocate, I see you passionately nodding your head there when you say, you know, we need change.
Absolutely.
You know,
I mean, this is what I meant when I was saying that this change hopefully brings a whole new narrative and a whole dynamic on the continent, but also globally. I think David is quite right. There are already noises that are agreeing that the neoliberal orthodoxy and the so-called monetarist view and all that is dead. It's not going to be, obviously, it's not going to happen overnight. But I think that this continent in particular is going to be where the germination of some of the new ideas, economic thinking. Just think even globally, just mention a few people, Piketty, Sanders in the US, the Labour Party, you know, in the Syriza Party in Greece and so on. There's a growing voice internationally that is saying we need a new economic outlook. And I'm making a prediction that some of the changes you are seeing in Zimbabwe, some of the changes that you are witnessing here, which might not yet be visible, and around the continent, are going to be a huge part of that thinking. Whether it is in partnership with the so-called West or some of these voices that are growing, or China or those kinds of global players. But the point of the matter is that we are in the middle. You know, we might not feel it because we are part of it now, but we're in the middle of a changing world. And I think that the times of the Mugabes and those types of so-called liberation movement, big guy politics is over.
Now, there's something that we haven't spoken about, and it's going to require us to backtrack a little bit. And that's Mugabe's almost notion that he had support. For some reason, he seemed as though he actually believed that he had the love and support of the people of Zimbabwe on the ground. Now, let's look at the reasons behind this. Did he really believe this, or was it a case of him just... Why did he believe that?
Well, you must never underestimate the propaganda machine of these so-called liberation movements. You know, you have the staged rally, you have all the money that has been stolen, basically, and that money is then used to bus people and stage manage. You have the broadcasters, you have all that. But the reality on the ground is quite different. And that is why you're seeing jubilation now across the world. In Hillbrow, the biggest party, I think, is in Hillbrow and Sunnyside. Those are signs that the real people on the ground were feeling this disgruntlement. But come election time, they were able to unleash the machinery and the propaganda machinery, and we saw all those big rallies.
And that's when people should have an opportunity to actually act out how they feel, right?
Absolutely.
During election time.
Yeah, but then all the images that we see is Grace and the old man walking, and you think that everyone loves them.
Happy.
Absolutely.
Everyone else is happy. Prof, your sentiments there?
Well, those interface with the youth sessions that Grace and Robert had, they were press gang kids from schools. The militia, the Green Bombers would go to the schools and tell the teachers to put the kids on a Zanu-PF bus and take them there. That's the sort of, when I was there first in 1984, I rented a house in a modest suburb, and the guy who worked there, he would leave the house on Sunday mornings, leave his house in the high-density suburbs, the townships, at 4 o'clock in the morning so that he could escape the people going around telling, oh, time to come to a rally, you know, drag him out, he'd rather go fishing. So that's going to go. That's going to disappear. Yeah. So it'll be a big change. Robert Mugabe, look, I'm almost more of a historian than a political scientist. Right through the 70s, there were crises after crises within Zanu-PF. March 1975, the national chairman of Zanu-PF, Herbert Chitepo, was sort of in competition with Mugabe or other people. Goes into his Volkswagen Beetle, boom, assassinated. There's a massive leadership vacuum for about 2 years, 2.5 years. Mugabe's nowhere to be seen. At least people don't really know where he is. He eventually ends up under house arrest in Mozambique. Samora Machel puts him on a house arrest because he doesn't, who are you, a leader? In the meantime, a group of young radicals, Marxists, are leading the war from late 1975 till 77. And they end up challenging the ideas of Mugabe, who's coming into power with the help of friends around the world, like the UK. He squashes them. He and Samora Machel put this group of young Turks in jail for 3 years. That happens again. Gokurahundi, right? Okay, flash forward, independence. Within days of independence, Robert Mugabe and his party were trying to squash ZAPU. One reason he was allowed to do that was because the ANC and ZAPU were colleagues, comrades. Margaret Thatcher and her friends thought the ANC was controlled by the Soviet Union. So fine, let's just squash ZAPU, and that will help squash the ANC, and the Soviets will, be, they won't come in and take over. So those sorts of politics were going on. So Mugabe, it's not just that he was in this fantasy world. He could deal with these crises and get rid of people and play all sorts of politics, ethnic politics. Maybe towards the end of his life, his new young wife, Grace, was pumping him up with this sort of, you are the anointed one. But that could have also been strategic because they were trying to get him to say, you can come next.
So I think keeping with that, let's look at the new face of power in Zimbabwe. I mean, Emmerson Mnangagwa is being mentioned as the guy who's going to take the top spot, but there are other people in the mix. Joyce Mujuru is there as well. Let's look at this in depth. What and who is the new face of politics in Zimbabwe?
Well, unfortunately, from a political party point of view, there's no new face because it's all going to be Zanu-PF, unless, of course, they go the route of the GNU, Government of National Unity. And the question is, when are the next elections going to take place? Because whatever government gets in now is going to be, its legitimacy is going to be under question, even if it's a government of national unity, until such time that it has been legitimized by elections. It is at that point that I'm hoping that there will be a new infusion of more women. I mean, there are no women in that leadership. You see even
Joyce?
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean Joyce, yeah, but you saw the press conference on Sunday. Well, the only thing that was striking is that yeah,
they were men.
Yeah, absolutely. And that other meeting, the only woman in that room was our Minister of Defense. So it's so there's that. There's a question of bringing in the youth, as I say, and fresh thinking. But you know what? We mustn't be too hard on Mugabe. He certainly overstayed his welcome. But in the first phase of his leadership, he did a great job in Zimbabwe. The education more than anything else. Forget even about the land redistribution. But the emphasis on education was crucial, and it's something that nobody can take. And South Africans are testimony to. I mean, we have every second professor in every university is a Zimbabwean. Every person who works in a bank is a Zimbabwean. Peter Ndoro and all sorts
our very own.
our own, yeah. So that's a crucial, because even the land, somebody can take it back or can reverse it and so on. But education is a legacy that must really go to his credit. Of course, at a particular point, particularly since 2008, that what we call the stolen election, then the legitimacy went out of the window and there was a repression and so on. And David is right. For South Africans in particular, of my generation, the relationship with Mugabe has always been ambivalent because our natural ally was Joshua Nkomo, who was the person who was quite close to the ANC and our struggle more directly. But he was admired, rightly so, as I said, in the mold of your Nyereres and so on. But obviously, it all went wrong, and it has to. I mean, no single person, whoever you are, can rule a country for 37 years and you don't just kind of mess it up or start to think that it belongs to you personally or your wife or, you know, that kind of familiarity and thinking that you must die on the throne.
Now we're running out of time, but Prof, your parting shot?
The throne, yes. This could have been a dynasty.
Yeah, almost.
Easily.
Yeah.
And it might still be a dynasty because Mnangagwa he's 75, or maybe he's a bit older. There's uncertainty about his birth because the story is that he joined the guerrilla struggle at a young age, and when he was caught, he wasn't hanged because he was too young. That might not be the story. He might not have been hanged because he was let out early for some other reasons. So the ambiguities are still there. But I think a crucial thing is that what could have been just an intra-party faction fight, an intergenerational fight, a fight over the spoils, what turned it into something different from most coups is that there had to be this democratic element, those people on the streets. And Mnangagwa's no fool. They say he's a born-again Christian. Maybe he wants to be forgiven for his past because he was actually implemented Gukuruni, which was the blot. You know, Delhi was talking about the good stuff going on socioeconomically during the 80s, but there was that big blot, which was Gukuruni. Also an ethnic issue. This is something that's going to have to be resolved. I think Temuka was saying we're going to have to have a TRC, that sort of thing. And the opposition will have to get their act together because this is a time like no other, but they've kind of fallen to pieces in the past 5 years.
I guess the next few days are going to be very telling, gentlemen. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
That was Professor David Moore from the University of Johannesburg, as well as Advocate Dalim Mpofu joining me live in studio for some in-depth analysis on the current development in Zimbabwe. I'll have more news and analysis for you after the break. Don't go anywhere.
It takes patience and the finest ingredients to craft a milk stout of superior quality that is made to be savored by the most refined palate. Castle Milk Stout. Savor your richness.
Have we taken enough responsibility for our responsibilities with regards to freedom?
Largely the moment of 1994, that moment of absolute magic. Firstly, the voting, and of course when we watched Nelson Mandela take that oath of office, was a moment that we thought, well, we've now reached freedom. This is it. This is all that it can be.
Off with the big story of the day where Eugenie Bouchard beat Maria Sharapova for the first time. Bouchard upped the ante and closed off the 3-hour epic grudge match with a rousing performance to win the most highly anticipated match so far in this year's clay season. Final score 7-5, 2-6, 6-4. Title chasers Cape Town City FC travel to Pretoria intent on grabbing 3 points from a resurgent SuperSport United.
Get all the dominating stories locally and globally on Newsroom every Monday to Friday from 9 a.m.
Welcome back to your world in SABC News Channel 404. Now staying with our Zimbabwe analysis, Zimbabwe's former Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa will be sworn in as president tomorrow or Thursday. Zanu-PF Legal Secretary Patrick Chinamasa has confirmed this after the resignation of Robert Mugabe earlier tonight. Zanu-PF Chief Whip Lavmo Matuke says that Mnangagwa will serve the remainder of Mugabe's term until the next general elections, which must be held by September 2018. Mugabe resigned as Zimbabwe's president on Tuesday, shortly after Parliament began an impeachment process to end his nearly 4 decades of rule. The 93-year-old clung on for a week after an army takeover and expulsion from his ruling Zanu-PF party.
The Honorable Jacob Mudenda, notice of resignation.
They couldn't even wait for the whole statement. While celebrations broke out at a joint sitting of Parliament when Speaker Jacob Mudenda announced Mugabe's resignation and suspended the impeachment procedure.
Yeah, we are happy.
Yeah, we are happy.
We are
don't know
so
what
happy.
to say.
We're overwhelmed.
We're really overwhelmed, hey?
The statement read, I, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, in terms of Section 96 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe, hereby formally tender my resignation with immediate effect. The letter does not, however, mention who he was leaving in charge of the country. The Speaker added he was working on legal issues to make sure a new leader was in place by the end of Wednesday. Some people held posters of Zimbabwean Army Chief General Constantino Chiwenga and former President Emmerson Mnangagwa, whose sacking this month triggered the military takeover that forced Mugabe to resign.
Free nation, free people, free, free, free! Yeah! Yeah, we are free at last. We are so happy.
The origin of Mugabe's sudden downfall lies in a rivalry between members of Zimbabwe's ruling elite over who will succeed him rather than popular protests against his rule. The army seized power after Mugabe sacked Zanu-PF's favorite to succeed him, Emmerson Mnangagwa, to smooth a path to the presidency for his wife Grace, known to her critics as Gucci Grace for her reputed fondness of luxury shopping. Mnangagwa, a former security chief known as the Crocodile, is expected to take over as president.
Every child born in Zimbabwe from today never has to call Robert Mugabe their president, ever. Every child born in Zimbabwe from today onwards never has to call Robert Mugabe their president. Nothing elates me more than that. Nika yese kufara, that means the whole country is celebrating. They said we couldn't do it, we did it.
He is gone. He is no more. Rest in peace.
Mugabe is the only leader Zimbabwe has known since a guerrilla struggle ended white minority rule in former Rhodesia. Lehana Tsoteti, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Now here's how Speaker Jacob Mudenda announced the news of Mugabe's resignation.
Formally tender my resignation as the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe with immediate effect.
Now, earlier we spoke to Dr. Pezisai Ruhanya from the University of Johannesburg, as well as MDC spokesperson in South Africa, Austin Moyo, and Tino Mambeu, Zimbabwe Exiles Forum in South Africa.
Speaking to Austin Moyo, who's the shadow ambassador for the MDC in South Africa, but we're also now joined by Dr. Pezisai Ruhanya from the University of Johannesburg. And gentlemen, I'm guessing that you were old enough to remember what it was like in 1980. I certainly was. And the same euphoria I'm seeing now, that was what it was like back then for what we thought was going to be an amazing future for the country. Dr. Ruhanya?
Yes, this is a very historic moment for our country and the citizens. As you can see, they have every right to celebrate. This is a joyous moment. They must enjoy it. But they must enjoy it looking at the future of the state. What will be the future of the state tomorrow after the celebrations, which are very legitimate, which are very important because they've been going through 37 years of authoritarian rule, 37 years of economic regression, 37 years of political regression, 37 years of de-democratization. So they have every right to enjoy the moment, enhance it, but what will the future of Zimbabwe to do? There are certain things that need to be addressed as a matter of urgency. And one of the fundamental issues that need to be addressed as a matter of urgency is the question of the livelihood of Zimbabwe, the socio-economic question. There is need to resuscitate the economy as a matter of urgency, because for the past 15 years, the political economy of Zimbabwe has been going through a seismic, tremendous informalization of the economy. And the informalization of the economy has made graduates, has made technocrats to do what they are not supposed to be doing because of the nature of their training. So they need to address the socio-economic question. How do people send their children to school? How do people put bread on the table? How do people access medication? How do people send their children to school, access medication, have a health functional...
I want to explore that in greater detail just now, but perhaps let's deal with the immediate issue. The vanquished, what happens to them? We've seen images of Jonathan Moyo and Kaskwere in an aeroplane. It seems as if they've been allowed to leave. Jonathan Moyo there, perhaps not being very honest with the history that he has with Robert Mugabe, saying that he's very happy that he served under him. But this is a man who was banished by him at some point, Mr. Moyo.
Yeah, I don't think he's being truthful with himself. He's just trying to impress Mugabe. I don't know for what reason, but it's really obvious that he's out now as well.
He was one of the voices that was very outspoken against Emmerson Mnangagwa, and so in many respects he had absolutely no chance of staying in the country, I guess. What was that beef about between Moyo and Mnangagwa?
Well, what we know as a matter of history is that Professor Moyo is a political chameleon. He changes color when it suits him. When it was in his interest, he was Mnangagwa's friend. But when he realized that Mugabe did not want Mnangagwa to succeed, he turned against Mnangagwa and became Mugabe's ardent supporter. So that is it. He had read politics. He's a professor of political science. So he has read through his interaction with Mugabe and how the state was being run, that it was not in the interest of Mugabe for Mnangagwa to succeed. That's how he turned against Mnangagwa. But if you look, in 2008, before he was readmitted, Professor Moyo is recorded as saying that even if a donkey stands against President Mugabe in an election, he will lose, not because the donkey is more popular than Mugabe, but because Mugabe has become unelectable. This is Jonathan Moyo for you.
So what does happen now? Will Emmerson Mnangagwa be forced to assess the cabinet ministers that are still there, test their loyalty and do a reshuffle? What's his next move, do you think, gentlemen? Mr. Moyo?
I think being a new president that will have just been installed, he will have to come up with his own cabinet. I don't think he will carry on with a cabinet that was put by somebody else. He will have to do his own calculations on who will perform best in which position, because he is faced with a difficult task of bringing Zimbabwe out of the intensive care unit.
Is there enough talent within Zanu-PF to do some of those economic jobs that you were talking about?
No, with due respect, Zanu-PF and all those characters, they've been in power since 1980. Mnangagwa has been in cabinet since 1980. He's one of the longest serving cabinet ministers, together with the defense minister, Sekeremane. So if ZANU is not going to reform, it will die just like what has happened to Mugabe. So in order to have a turnaround, ZANU-PF must enforce within its culture democratic values, democratic institutions, and a democratic culture. If ZANU is not going to democratize its internal politics and consequently democratize the politics of the state, they will die. They have to reform.
All right, so those jubilations, celebrations, and they're saying Tondeza, Chiwenga, we're saying that we will call Chiwenga. And this is an interesting development, gentlemen. Chiwenga suddenly has become the hero, the chief blesser of the people. He was the enforcer-in-chief of Robert Mugabe, and now people have forgotten literally overnight, because he's gotten rid of Mugabe, they're embracing him. Is this political capital risen, or are people going to wake up in the morning with sober thoughts?
I think it just shows how quickly people forget, you know, because at the moment they seem to have forgotten all the wrong things that happened in the past. What they are living now is the now moment going forward. The obstacle that they thought was the obstacle, Mugabe, is out, and the feeling is that without Mugabe everything will start moving forward. So it will be tomorrow they will wake up to reality, and depending on what will happen, how the policies will be done. We have got 9 months to look at the Zanu-PF government that will be installed. The people have got 9 months to look at it and judge and decide whether when they go to elections they still continue with them or they decide to change.
Will Mnangagwa allow a system where he's only president for 10 months after waiting for so many years?
In the absence of a constitutional amendment, there is no way he can change the current constitution to make sure that he rules forever. He has to finish Mugabe's term. If he's going to be installed by Zanu as the leader of Zanu, he has to finish Mugabe's term. If he decides not to do that, then there has to be a broad consensus that brings in the opposition and other social forces to make sure that if they put in an inclusive government, it surpasses the current term that President Mugabe, former President Mugabe was serving. So there's no way out in the absence of a constitutional amendment.
Apparently he comes back tomorrow. What will be the first thing that he has to say to Zimbabwe when he makes his first appearance?
I think his statement was very clear. Yes, he already made a statement. I don't think he would deviate from the statement that he made earlier today, where he was talking of unity, where he was talking of inclusivity, where he was talking about dealing with issues of corruption, where he was talking about regenerating the economy and regenerating the political economy of the state. So he will try to be a statesman, try to bring every force around to make sure that he is received properly. Because Zimbabweans have not forgotten. You must remember that where we are today is not a result of things that happened because he was fired or because the generals were insecure. This is a result of a build-up that started in 1980 with the Gukura wound in 1980, in 2000 with the massacres of opposition human rights defenders, in 2002 the 2002 rigged election, in 2005 Operation Mramashina, in 2008 when the military blocked the ascendance of Tsvangirai. So what the military did was simply to capture the moment, but this moment was a build-up of years of struggle, of years of human rights struggles against this authoritarian regime that the military was part of.
So we're saying that, as people are busy analyzing, they're saying that this was about grace, this was about the army. Are you saying that we shouldn't downplay the masses of the people that have been putting pressure on the regime for many years?
I think grace played a crucial role. He actually put the man in a corner, also maybe taking advantage of his age. The people were quiet because of the draconian laws that are in place. They couldn't demonstrate freely, and we saw that what they are capable of on Saturday when the gates were opened, when they said go on the streets and show what you can. I know it's just a few 100,000, but even those that were at home were also in the same mood. There was not one person who came out and said this is wrong.
We're now joined by Tinombe, who's with the Zimbabwe Exiles Forum here in South Africa. And your thoughts, your reaction when you heard the news, I bet you didn't believe it at first.
Well, you know, when I received the call, I did not want to believe that. But I knew that it was time. And I had to make some few more calls to trusted lieutenants actually make sure that the news was correct and that it had happened. You know, I'm 31 years old. I grew up and I was born within his administration. My kids, I've got a son who is 10 years old. And, you know, I could not fathom the idea of him also becoming a man under the same administration of Robert Mugabe. And it's an overwhelming relief. I'm so happy. I'm ecstatic. I do not know how I can describe my moment in time.
Time now for a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
Why is there a dispute over who is the rightful heir to the throne?
What I can say is that Masindi is a woman. She's a girl. She's a girl child. Because I think that if she was a male,